I'm going to be reviewing Finding Truth, 5 Principles for Unmasking Atheism, Secularism, and Other God Substitutes by Nancy Pearcey, the best-selling and critically acclaimed author, who used to be a former agnostic, and throughout her research was able to develop 5 powerful principles for penetrating the core of any worldview, secular or religious, to uncover the deepest motivations and weigh the claims of each. After doing so, she became a very active proponent of Christian apologetics. And in this book, she beautifully combines almost all of the forms of apologetics, with autopistic being the central focus in how she chooses to put forth Christianity as the only coherent explanation of reality, and to give exposure of the epistemic and moral dissonance of non-Christian worldviews. She also has axiopistic apologetics and does a good job of proclaiming the truth claims of Christianity and judging them credible as she uses reason and evidence to build a case for Christianity. It is also subjectivist, and she believes and says throughout the work that sometimes it requires an experience of God's grace to fully understand the love of God, because without that we aren't capable of understanding that. And there's also relational apologetics, and she talks about how lives are changed for believers through Christianity, and how God's love is shown, and in a perfect example of Christian walk, we would show love to one another. Now, that often doesn't happen due to the brokenness of our world and our lack of clarity and our dissonance in our views. And she also brings in culture and how modern culture does create that gap, that lack of understanding due to our subconscious acceptance of secular worldviews in our daily lives. And she builds a case for prudential apologetics and why we should choose Christianity, because it is definitely the most adequate representation and the best choice to fully understand the world that we live in. Excuse me. Throughout the work, she goes into depth on how many other non-Christian worldviews follow the principles of reductionism, and how atheism, materialism, secularism, romanticism, Islam, and postmodernism create idols of matter, senses, mind, and imagination that build a case for the dethroning of humanity, that allows for mistreatment, oppression, abuse, and exploitation of other people for our own selfish goals. This being said, there are also many secular leaps of faith that are required to explain their worldview and why it doesn't line up with what we know about the world. So to do that, we, as people, often fill in the gaps with emotional or subjectivist teachings. And often the gaps are filled with Christian beliefs, and they don't align with the worldview at all. In a lot of ways, they're all able to be self-refuting. They provide definitions of truth and fact, but in itself, they are not capable of defining that very principle within itself. For example, the argument that we have no objective truth, and that everything is subjective to human nature is very ironic, considering that that statement in itself is saying that it is an objective truth, which negates the entire purpose of that theory. And as we go through this book, Nancy Pearcey starts off with a very helpful intro on why we often, as Christians, struggle as we get into college and into the intellectual world, and why that hurts our faith, because oftentimes in the Western church today, we don't provide adequate answers to life questions, but Nancy Pearcey suggests studying your way back to God, and gives evidence from life and personhood, and goes into why atheism is simply suppression of the evidence, and how it requires a tug of war in the soul between meaning and purpose, and simply ignoring God, who is the author of meaning and purpose. And she goes into how idols, which are, as she defines it, anything that takes focus away from God, and how those have consequences in our lives, and how they cause us to react, and how they make us feel. And she goes into her 5 strategic principles, which are to identify the idols, and identify those idols' reductionism, which is placing our worldview within a limited box. And she uses that to then test those idols to see if it contradicts what we know about the world. Is there something that's outside of the box? Is there something that doesn't really fit with what we're saying? And then testing it on whether it contradicts itself, and then replacing that idol by making a case for Christianity, so that we can live out the love of God at school and at work with liberated minds. And in the second part of her book, she goes into more depth on the principles and how we can know what idols are, and which things in our lives are taking away the focus from God, and how that hurts us. And in Principle 2, she goes into depth on all the different forms of reductionism in the different worldviews, be it atheism, materialism, secularism, romanticism, Islam, postmodernism, just to name a few, and how each of those views reduce humanity to something less than the high dignity of human personhood that Christianity suggests is true. And she goes into depth on how there are leaps of faith within them, and why they basically commit intellectual suicide in and of themselves based on their own definitions, and goes into the fifth principle, which talks a lot about how different worldviews are freeloading off of Christianity for their sense of purpose, or their spiritualism, or their facts to back them up, to give them some foundation, and why we should choose Christianity over these worldviews, and what implications that has. And in her third part of the book, she goes into how we are churched but not prepared, and how secularism has become a major part of our world, and how critical thinking can save our faith, and how we can use painting, art, to see how philosophy affects our view of the world, be it Impressionism, Cubism, abstract art, or postmodernism, which allow us to look deeper at the different worldviews of those days. And she goes into what makes our theology make sense for us, and how we can critique and create the current worldviews and create new life-giving ones. And she goes into how the Bible is a total book for total truth, and how Lecrae actually came to Christianity and became the influential artist that he is today, which I found was a very meaningful part of the book, being that I love Lecrae's music, and I've loved to see his walk, and just to hear from his perspective why Christianity is breaking free from our bondage to this world. I have found that throughout this work, I've found it hard to find any real weaknesses with her presentation. There are definitely not a lot of gaps. She does a great job of being detailed and going into depth on theology, emotions, facts, and just laying it out in such a beautiful way in which we can see how each of these principles really affects our lives. For me, it was extremely helpful to think of idols in this new light, because oftentimes in church, I was never really able to understand what the pastor was saying. He said that, anything can be an idol, but why is it an idol? What makes it an idol? How do I know this? The reoccurring themes throughout this are idols, be that the matter, senses, mind, and imagination, and how we distract ourselves from God to continue to live in our sinful ways, and using that to turn it back to Christianity, and how morality is a major part of that, and how every other worldview does some type of freeloading off of Christianity. And I find that to be really helpful. And in evaluating it, I definitely suggest this book to anyone who wants to find a deeper understanding of what we believe as Christians and what it really means